But so welcome everyone. My name is Angel Dominguez, and I'm the Ganas Graduate Services Counselor here on campus, and it is my great honor and pleasure to be kicking off the Fall 2023 HSI Equity Talk with the great Professor Christine Hong. On behalf of the HSI team and in collaboration with the Center for Racial Justice, we welcome you. Please note that we will be recording this talk, so if you are joining us on Zoom, please feel free to turn your camera off. First, we'd like to share a land acknowledgement. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking UP tribe. The Amamutsin tribal band, comprised of the descendants of Indigenous people taken to Mission, Santa Cruz, and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. We are thrilled to be restarting this talk series as a means of sharing space for community conversation, and we'll be hosting an equity talk every quarter this academic year. In its reimagined incarnation, the HSI Equity Talk series hopes to be, quote, a place for regular discussion on topics relevant to UC Santa Cruz as a Hispanic serving institution. We seek to engage speakers from across campus as we welcome the attendees to engage critically with the content presented at these talks. Together, we will unpack complex topics centered on the praxis of equity and servingness. And for the purposes of this talk series, we're looking at servingness through the conceptual lens that Garcia, Nunez, and Sansoni argue is a multidimensional and conceptual way to understand what it means to move from simply enrolling Latinx students to actually serving them. And I think that's really where the importance of praxis comes in for these talks, and perhaps this is a good juncture to begin to introduce Professor Christine Hong, someone whose commitment to social justice, equity, inclusion, and belonging are centered in praxis and not merely theoretical. Professor Hong's vital work and visioning on this campus and beyond has inspired and continues to inspire me, and no doubt countless others, to further root our approaches to DEIB and social justice work in a fearless praxis that centers historically underserved communities. Professor Hong is a force to be reckoned with, and you can ask anyone who has had the opportunity to share space with her. It's this focused force that has, in part, brought about and sustains the unique and necessary work of the Center for Racial Justice and CRES on our campus in ways that think critically about the histories of UC Santa Cruz as a means of clearly envisioning sustainable futures. It's this work that further insists upon the necessity of praxis to better serve our campus community in compassionate and impactful ways that affirm that commitment to equity and servingness. Christine Hong is a professor of critical race and ethnic studies and literature, and also directs the Center for Racial Justice at UC Santa Cruz. Professor Hong serves on the board of directors of the Korea Policy Institute, an independent research and educational institute, co-chair the UC Ethnic Studies Faculty Council, and co-edits the Critical Ethnic Studies Journal. Professor Hong is also a core member of the Ending the Korean War Teaching Collective and the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. Professor Hong's book, Of Violent Peace, Race, Militarism, and Cultures of Democratization in Cold War Asia and the Pacific, was published by Stanford University Press in 2020. Along with Dean Borshe Lim, Professor Hong co-directed the Legacies of the Korean War Oral History Project. Today, Professor Hong brings us the long struggle for critical race and ethnic studies, described as, quote, on campus, where the main administrative building is named after UC President Clark Kerr, who presided over the opening of UC Santa Cruz in 1965, and where the library immortalizes the inaugural chancellor, Dean E. McHenry, there are few overt reminders of the many decades of direct action by students and faculty who replenished the front line in the decades-long struggle for ethnic studies. Students of color, Indigenous students, and Black students led the way in transforming this predominantly white institution, staging hunger strikes, seizing control over events, and transforming them into the grounds for brilliant guerrilla theater and teaching their own political education classes. More than recover the history of their struggles, How do we animate their legacies in the present? There will be a brief Q&A following this talk should time allow, and I hope you will all join me in welcoming Professor Christine Hong, everyone.
Well, if you sit there, they can see you.
Oh,
They
I
can
see.
see you. You sit
I
here.
see.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Because my inclination is to stand and walk about. Is that not advisable?
I mean, it's totally advisable.
You do whatever you want.
All right. All right.
Yeah.
Anil, thank you so much for introducing me and for your generosity. Paris, you as well for inviting me to speak to you today as part of this series. And, you know, we were having these initial inaugural planning discussions and just brainstorming ideas. And one thing that I thought was really important to be able to focus on is the fact that UC Santa Cruz, you know, let me back up for a moment. One of my brilliant colleagues in CRES, Nick Mitchell, has spoken about how we have to rethink what the definition of student is and how to also understand the student as a worker, as a surplus, part of a surplus population, right? The question that I want to pose is how ethnic studies struggle, the struggle from the grassroots, as a struggle from below, enables us to think of the university anew. If we typically think, and the university fully encourages us to think about the university as coming to you sort of ready-made in static form with names adorning different buildings. And not coincidentally, the vast majority of these names, just as is the case with street names and building names in the areas where we live, are the names of white men, right? So the university enables us to think, or encourages us to think of the university as a place that was created and generated through the donations of funders and through the visionary labor of founders. So this funder-founder kind of model. But that top-down vision of the university never does justice to the ways in which the meaning of the university has been contested from below through student struggle. And that history, which is so hard to capture, I don't think it could be telling the university in the same fashion. So you replace the name of Oaks with Malcolm X and call it a day, right? Instead, I think that there is value to studying those struggles, and that's actually essential to ethnic studies as a field. You don't just study the histories, you study your own struggles. That becomes absolutely essential, both to the field of study, but also to the praxis orientation. You don't just study for the sake of acquiring knowledge, you study in order to act. And those things are indissociable, right? And so I wanted to suggest that one thing that looking at UC Santa Cruz with its long history of ethnic study struggle, one thing that affords us is ample opportunity to study protracted student struggle. I've often stated, I used to proselytize by going from large lecture classroom to large lecture classroom to let students know about CRES, to build up our major numbers. And indeed, we were the only unit in the entirety of the humanities that had a growth target that was placed on us. We had to actually build our major numbers up to 100 before we could ask for a replenishment of instructional resources. So this model of growth that was exceptionally attached to us depended upon the invisibilization and exploitation of our labor, but not just ours. When I say ours, it's not just faculty administrators, it's also students who are teaching. Raul's here, and can speak to an entire trajectory within ethnic studies on this campus where students for years held things down by teaching course content in areas that were not prioritized by Senate faculty. So there's an entire history from below. And this is the other thing that I want to say too. Oftentimes there are DEI discussions that are sort of done in abstract here. Like what could be done from above? Like if we threw some funding at what could happen? Rarely are there discussions of how campus climate might be transformed if we were to prioritize, to research, to teach the history of student struggle. I really wonder, what would it mean for students who are coming in to know that there was a period at UC Santa Cruz called the underground years, in which undocumented students did mutual aid, worked out an agreement with the dining hall staff so that after hours, the food insecure among them could have access to food, created a sort of book borrowing system among themselves to be able to share course materials without having to purchase them, anticipated the work of USS, Undocumented Student Services. What would it mean for students to know that even prior to the sort of fully fledged establishment of history of consciousness as a department, that students who were at the very first graduation at UC Santa Cruz in 1969 took over the commencement stage, not only did they turn their backs and hold up their fists, protesting the grotesque counter-revolutionary, counterinsurgent, imperialist violence of US war in Vietnam, but also protesting the racism of this institution, and in a visionary act, awarded Huey Newton, who was in prison, a member of the Black Panther Party, who was in prison at the time, in absentia, awarded Huey Newton a diploma. Years later, Huey Newton would get a PhD in history of consciousness, but students led the way. What would it mean for students to know that long before the establishment of Black studies as a minor on this campus, students and community members who were part of the Black Liberation Front had called for what is now known as Oaks to be called the Malcolm X College, which was supposed to be a college that was dedicated to the study of the Black experience. What would it mean to know all of this, right? And what would it actually mean? Terms are often thrown about by administrators like campus climate. There's oftentimes an acknowledgement that even before there were serious cost of living issues at Santa Cruz, that this was a campus that was not hospitable to students of color. This was, the state of California became majority minority in 2000. UC Santa Cruz as a campus became majority minority in the 2008-2009 era. And there have often been questions about how do you recruit students of color? There have been serial protests by students against the anti-Black racism of this campus. But what would it mean if on a curricular level, if on many different levels, the history of Black student struggle were part of what students come here and learn? So in other words, what if we were to think about the university not simply as a place that you come to you go check out some books at the library, you bury your nose in books, you sit at a desk, you drink lots of coffee, and you take your finals. It's a place where you acquire knowledge, right? What if you weren't to think about it that way? But what if you were to think about the university as a site of protracted struggle in which students were contesting the university's function and the function of higher education more generally in reproducing the status quo of racial capitalism? So I think that that notion of the university is absolutely the opposite of a conservative, status quoist, preservationist conception of the university. In fact, it's profoundly emergent. It's responsive to grassroots struggles. And you see that in our name, CRES, the term critical is there. I view that term critical as being responsive to what is happening and being accountable to the grassroots. So I want to just go ahead and say a few things. You know, one of the terms that we often hear, and I'm going to just stand up because everyone's looking at the PowerPoint, right? So one of the things that people hear is like this, you know, the name of the student newspaper is City on a Hill. And few people think about what this term means or the historical origins of it, or the fact that it is fundamentally part of a US exceptionalist vision of democracy in this country as a shining light that all others should emulate, right? And actually, even that notion of democracy being exceptional, which you can trace back to Alexis de Tocqueville and far earlier, in fact, it actually is predicated upon the idea that the United States enables westward expansion and that there's ample land to take. And the capacity for there to be many property holders within one family instead of the eldest son alone, the entire idea that there is unfree labor, and if not unfree labor, then racialized cheap labor, becomes the basis of a notion of Republican stability that is baked into the notion of US democracy. Nonetheless, the sort of idea of the city on the hill is something that Santa Cruz takes up, you know, without really thinking about the kinds of violence, structural violence that's baked into that. But I also want to say something too. There have been these French theorists who've thought about this campus, right? And so people like Jean Baudrillard, Pierre Bourdieu, and they've said, Baudrillard described Santa Cruz as a strange, padded, wooded, pacified, convivial republic. And then, and Bourdieu stated that it was a postmodern social and electronic paradise from which all trace of work and exploitation has been effaced. So in both of these French theorists, there's this notion, this abstracted notion of the strangeness or exceptionality of Santa Cruz. It's almost like a place that is no place. It's a utopia or a dystopia. This is the native Hawaiian scholar who passed away, Haunani K. Trask. And this is how she described it. And I want to also say this too. There is a long history of Pacific Islander feminist visionary work that has happened at UC Santa Cruz. But for years, the people who held it down were graduate students. They came here, they organized, they populated the field. But while they were here, they did something that this university only in the past couple of years has really started to orient itself toward, which is that these Native Pacific Islander feminists understood that this campus is perched as part of Oceania, is part of the Indigenous Pacific. And instead of understanding this place as surf, sun, and what have you, really understanding it as part of Oceania is something that Native Pacific Islander scholars did. But they were structurally here only to be sort of effaced by the fact that they were students. But Haunani K. Trask states, and this is in an essay called The Color of Violence. She states that at one time, the land upon which UC Santa Cruz sits, as all lands in California, was home to an untold number of Native tribes, and goes on to describe them, and says that the forgetting of this is the color of violence. She says it's the color of white over black, white over brown, white over red, white over yellow. So I wanted to offer this as a kind of point of contrast to understand that part of the history of CREZ is a reorientation to where we are located, right? So I wanted to say, let me say this. I oftentimes give an account of CREZ, and I'm going to do so now just to tell you about the most recent chapter of struggle for critical race and ethnic studies at Santa Cruz. So unlike every single other UC campus, with exception of Merced and also San Francisco, all the UCs that have undergraduate programs, Santa Cruz was indeed the exception to the establishment of ethnic studies much more broadly. And we have to ask why that is, right? I mean, anyone who has studied the origins of ethnic studies knows that it emerged in the Third World Liberation Front strikes that occurred at Bay Area universities. And if we consider that Santa Cruz is, broadly speaking, part of the Bay Area, we are right to ask the question, what the heck was happening here when these massive strikes were occurring in the Bay Area? And what I'll say is this. One generation after another of students fought for ethnic studies. And it was from the Great Recession period of 2009, 2010, that was only the most recent chapter of struggle for ethnic studies, that there was this emergence of this first program and now department of critical race and ethnic studies. And, we often say that we stand on the shoulders of others. And again, I don't think that it's the right approach to try to name everyone who was part of this struggle, but to understand that this struggle was very, very profound. And one thing that was operative here at Santa Cruz that militated against the development of ethnic studies was this idea by principally white faculty. And even now, though the student body composition has shifted, Senate faculty are still majority white, right? But one thing that militated against the development of ethnic studies here was an argument by liberal, ostensibly well-meaning faculty who said, you know what, I teach X, Y, and Z class, and I include race. So the idea that merely including race would be sufficient to recategorize a course as ethnic studies was the fundamental misconception of ethnic studies that was operative here, and that militated against the formation of ethnic studies. And so I'll say this about CREZ right now. CREZ has about 150 majors and minors. It's the fastest growing major in the entirety of the humanities. During the time that I served as first co-director, then director, and then chair, we grew the faculty from 1.5 FTE, so people can have partial lines in CRES, some people had 0% appointments, to now over 12 FTE. So it has grown significantly. And I often say this because it's so, I find the formation of CRES so interesting. It is one of the most globally multi-sided ethnic studies programs in the nation. It's really, really multilingual. It also is both multidisciplinary and anti-disciplinary. And one thing that I think is so interesting about ethnic studies is that because it grounds justice as a method, it asks the question of field, not just, hey, you know what, environmental studies, just add a little bit of race in there and call it a day. Instead, it asks people in that field to question the very formation of the field of knowledge. What kind of structural violence was baked into that? What notion of the environment was presented? And what sort of other kinds of philosophies was that in conversation with? Was it linked, for example, to notions of property? Was it linked to notions of capture? Was it linked, so all of these kinds of questions, let's say a field like biology, to what degree, if your method is actually one of justice, and if you ask the question, who is a producer of knowledge, what knowledge counts and why, how would a field like biology then actually self-reflect upon the conditions of its formation, its relationship at its origins to scientific racism, its relationship to the field of eugenics? What kinds of racialized violence, what kinds of histories of experimentation are baked into the fields, right? And why do you study this? You study this not just for the sake of knowledge, but for the purpose of social transformation, right? And so we have this really amazing faculty, and we also have people who work at the intersection of creative arts and critical research, understanding that one thing that you can do, the disciplines discipline you. But what does it mean to unshackle yourself from those disciplinary norms and to get creative? What does it mean to rethink your citational politics? Citational politics is the way that you reproduce canons of knowledge, right? What if you were to shake that up? What if you were to also think about how people who are artists, who are creative practitioners, have often done critical work and are essential to movement building? What if you were to ground the reproduction of the field, not just in peer-reviewed articles, but in movement work, right? And movement work has always been central to ethnic studies. I'm not saying that every ethnic studies formation is necessarily critical, but I also invite us all not to mistake the institutionalized formation of the field with its animating politics or its political possibility or even its critical potential in the present. So I wanted to also state that when we were fighting for CRES, and I'm in a way casting too much attention on the part of the struggle that I was part of. So I'm just going to do this only to veer away from it, but just bear with me for a moment. So when I first came here, it was such an interesting thing. I went up to my office in the 6th floor of the Humanities building one day, and there was a student, Carol Hernandez, who was seated across from the door of my office. Carol had a skateboard, and I thought, who is this person? And she invited me to be. There were no faculty who were participating in the Student of Color Organizing Collective. But this collective, which included students who were from the Big Five Student of Color organizations, but also from autonomous organizing spaces, were the latest generation of students to whom baton of the struggle for ethnic studies had been passed. I had no idea why Carol came to my office. I had been hired into literature. I had no idea why, but that was in a way the beginning of the most recent chapter. It was the conversations that occurred between graduate students, undergraduates, and faculty. And as part of this process, students who had been teaching their own political education courses, students who actually ended up doing so much organizing during the strike, calling not for an exfoliation of resources to students of color, which was happening at that moment during a time of resource scarcity and within the neoliberal university in a time of economic crisis. These students were the ones who said, actually, no, this is not a time for you to withdraw resources. And in fact, look at your bloated administrative budgets and to rethink what the priorities of this university should be. I'm saying this because that vision is what eventually prevails. That vision is nowhere captured. In fact, I will say this, I have heard administrators state that the formation of CRES is thanks to their strategic academic plans. That is not an accurate account of the formation of CRES. And I just do want to say that for the record. Okay, so this is one of the petitions that we put out, and I want to just call your attention to it because there's an animating vision here for CRES. And this was a petition back in 2011, and I wanted you just to see this, that this petition states that Santa Cruz had to shift its institutional priorities away from these gigantic administrative salaries. And what was very clear from the organizing at this time was that even the bonus of a high-ranking administrator exceeded the annual salary of an AFSCME employee, okay? And allocate permanent funding for CRES as an urgent comparative local and global interdisciplinary multilingual project, a theoretical and political project that articulates with queer, feminist, and labor studies in challenging these asymmetrical relations of social domination and instead fostering emergent forms of knowledge production. This was the animating vision. But it drew upon prior generations of student organizing. And when we put this out, within about 2 weeks' time, 1,000 people signed the petition. And you know how you can leave comments when you sign petitions? Among the comments were generations of students who in the 1990s fought for ethnic studies, in the 1980s fought for ethnic studies, and indeed were part of the 1981 hunger strike, who fought for ethnic studies in the 1970s. Each generation of this campus, people signed on. And they said, it's not just about time, it's overdue. It's overdue. And what would it mean to incorporate this into what we teach here, right? And students who have, this campus is amazing, really. Like, when you have the time, go look up every single previous disorientation guide. You are going to look at students who have produced critical knowledge about the university's centrality to the military, industrial, academic complex. You will look at students who research the history of the Ohlone people whose lands we're on. You will look at students who were imagining Santa Cruz as a sanctuary site during the 1980s, when the United States was waging counterinsurgent war in Central America. You will look at histories of students who were fighting against apartheid in South Africa. So the disorientation guide is a powerful way of situating ourselves in terms of place-based knowledge of the struggles that have occurred here. And this was also one of them. This is a blog, and I think it's in that tradition of the disorientation guide. And this was occurring, I'll just say this briefly. In 2011, the university had been roiled by something called the Compton Cookout. And the Compton Cookout was understood as happening at UC San Diego. It was understood as the actions of a white fraternity that basically put out a call on social media to fraternity brothers and sisters to come to the Compton Cookout and to come donning blackface and dressed as hoes and gangstas. And so this was something that happened, and when they were challenged on the racism of this party invitation, the fraternity brothers disavowed any understanding that the term cookout could possibly come from a Jim Crow lexicon around lynching, in which lynchings were understood as social affairs, right? That reconsolidated the whiteness and the white dominance and white supremacy of the community. So they said, we didn't know that cookout was part of a vocabulary, racist vocabulary that included terms like barbecue and roast. They said, we had no idea. They disavowed everything. And the other thing that happened during this time was at UC San Diego, there were 2 instances of nooses that were found hanging, including in the school library. But few people acknowledge that at that moment, there was a sympathy expression of nooses in graffiti form throughout the UC system, including multiple instances here on this campus. The chancellor at the time conceded to one discovery, but it was actually everywhere. And the students who were organizing took out their camera phones and they took photographs, and there's an archive of those images. That's part of another archive. It's not exactly the one that UC Santa Cruz broadcasts to the world, but it's part of an archive of student struggle here. And I also want to say that graduate students really shifted the tide. There was this, you could see here that the graduate students said, students have tirelessly organized for CREZ in spite of the fact that many of them will not have the opportunity to benefit from their efforts. In fact, many of them ended up taking longer to complete their degrees. And one thing that I'll also say about this was, it was actually in this room. What happened was graduate students, including Nick Mitchell, Yasmin Saidullah, Suzy Zepeda, people, they made the case, they read from the graduate student proposal. They anticipated and knocked down every single argument that had been trotted out against ethnic studies on this campus. Not only did they do that, but students, undergrads, who had been teaching their own ethnic studies courses, holding things down, spoke about the expectation of this university that they should do the recruitment work, they should do the retention work, they should do the campus climate work by self-exploiting in areas that the university refused to hire in. So there was this amazing gathering here. It was standing room only. And that was one of the moments of many where the tide really began to shift. And I want to say too, I want to actually make sure that we have time for Q&A. So let me just say that, I oftentimes point this out, like here, if you look in the middle here, you see that students who were part of the Black Liberation Front strike, it's so interesting to read about the very first graduation at Santa Cruz. When you start to read these, including in Clark Kerr, he was like the UC president throughout most of the 60s. He had this vision of the university that was called the California Master Plan for Education, which many people herald as being democratizing. But it's so, that is a narrative that needs to be contested. Places, he basically had a kind of segmented labor vision of the different, of California, college and university system where the UCs would turn out the managerial class and sort of leaders of tomorrow, the titans of capital. The CSUs would have the sort of mid-level sort of workers, nurses, teachers, etc. And that like labor would be produced by the community college system. And his sort of notion of the university, which has been heralded as democratizing, well, let me just say this. It was basically, what was I going to say about this? It was at the first graduation. He was invited as the guest of honor. And the first dean of UC Santa Cruz, Dean McHenry, was here. And when you read these accounts, I don't know if like you also can't help but laughing aloud, And what happened was the students who took over the graduation stage, they hurled their diplomas. They turned it into performance art. And they challenged the administrative structure in fundamental ways. This was a contest between students and administrators about who had the right to reproduce the university and whom did the university serve. It was that stark. So what happened was the Black Liberation Front invited Dean McHenry, whose name adorns our library, to come to a discussion to name what's now called Oaks, Malcolm X College. He pulled a no-show. He pulled a no-show. He was not present. Let me just say something because I actually want to go to this. There's so much that I would want to say, but I want to actually play something from the, will this actually work in terms of the audio?
You know what? I'm not sure. I've never played a video from a detail before.
Okay, let's try.
And clearly, this is more than enough evidence to convince the administration that our demands must be seriously considered. And yet,
And we can try the audio on the D10 on the touch screen. Yeah, that's what he told me.
Okay, should I try it again?
Yeah, try one more time. Yeah, good.
considered. And yet, they have the nerve to give us an unsigned, unofficial statement, which is the same old bullshit and the same old runaround that we've been hearing since 1969. And because of this insensitivity, this insult, and this unwillingness to seriously address our concerns, the Third World and Native American Studies Support Coalition is calling a hunger strike. We will not eat and we will not move from this location until the administration, Chancellor Sinsheimer, and Vice Chancellor Markham give us a written, signed commitment that this university will meet our demands to establish the foundations for a Third World and Native American Studies program.
per year.
They went on a 5-day strike before the administration.
Every year we would go, all spiffied up and speaking our best English and trying to be as reasonable and middle class as possible when we approach the administration. And we're always told, gee, you know, we really like Indians. You know, you guys are really a likable bunch of people. But, you know, there's just no money for you. And I have heard this all of my life. I faced racism of every conceivable kind, from the redneck cowboys to the sophisticated administrators and PhDs who poo-poo the idea that Indian people any longer have anything to teach the rest of the world, let alone people who live in their homeland. The idea that, you know, that place us in a social evolutionary scale where we're at the bottom and Western mass technological societies are at the top, I reject.
So I wanted to share this with you because this moment of intense organizing, and you could hear the first person who was speaking saying, what about 1969? This isn't 81, it's generation from generation to generation. And it's this moment, the vision for ethnic studies was not ethnic studies. In fact, I think ethnic studies is such a misnomer, and I think it was a strategic mistake for ethnic studies to be called ethnic studies, because as we can see in this historic moment, the way that ethnic studies is being interpreted, including by rightist diasporic figures in the United States, is as repressive ethno-nationalist studies. You can see, for example, a kind of BJP diaspora trying to seize hold of what ethnic studies should mean. You can also see rightist Korean evangelicals seizing hold of what ethnic studies can mean. You also see a Zionist seizure of what ethnic studies could mean. But the original term was third world. And third world, instead of ethnic studies, goes to the anti-imperialist politics of the field. And by aligning the struggles of peoples of color, indigenous peoples within the United States with the struggles of people around the world, there was a refusal to be contained within the kind of nation frame of the United States as a minority. Instead of being a minority, you were part of a global majority. And what happened in this moment was this hunger strike. The term that was adopted was Third World and Native American Studies, TWANUS. So these moments of struggle emerged. For example, it crystallized in a student publication that still exists to this day. But what the university did time and again was it tried to co-opt student struggle by placing 1 or 2 students on committees, and the duration of the committee would be 3 years. But the student was a senior or a super senior and was going to graduate. The student was one among a committee of 30 that had faculty and staff, right? So these were all methods of co-opting student struggle, and you saw it time and again, time and again. There might be some resources that materialized, maybe one line, but one line does not a stable curriculum make, right? So I think that what I will do, so I over-prepared material, but I'd rather just yield to questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Christine. And if folks in the flesh have any questions, please feel free to say your name, ask your question. Folks in the Zoom mundo, as it were, please put your questions into the chat. We'll read them aloud as well. We've got about 5 minutes until this event formally wraps, but if folks have like a few minutes extra, we can end at 2:35, if that's okay with everybody. So any questions?
Can I also just say that this is an opportunity? There's so many courses in our curriculum that deal with California. We could really do a California Studies certificate, but what if we did something collaboratively here? And already courses like Undocu Studies, courses like Black Radical University, these are all student-initiated courses, Filipinx Historical Dialogue, they're all within CRES. They are collaborations with student organizers and student organizations, and they study the history of student struggle. So what if we turned a lens on a curricular level, a research level, on those histories that are captured in sites like the Disorientation Guide? And what if we created a space for them to bloom? I welcome doing that work.
It can also be thoughts, comments, anything that came up for you over the course of this amazing presentation. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a question. Yes, in the back.
I'm trying to like get this oriented down. So my name is Angel Rio Tutar. I use all pronouns. I'm the director for the American Indian Research Center, and I'm really happy to be here. And I was listening on the Zoom so that I could hurry up and get here. I don't want to miss anything. I really appreciate the struggle. I mean, I've been associated with UCSC. I'm a local to Santa Cruz, so I'm born and raised here in Santa Cruz, and sitting on the hill has always been like one of those why is it called that? And once you know what is the deal, like it's isolating. It's a bubble. And when I was in high school, we used to joke that Santa Cruz was a fishbowl. You can look out, but you're not going anywhere. Right? You're just seeing like one vision, one side, and that's really similar to when you're going back to like 81, and we're looking at the struggles then, and the struggles have not changed. You know, they're still here, and having this conversation. So yesterday I was having a conversation about our basic needs, and why all suddenly it is really impacting our students. Well, it's impacting the staff. It's impacting all of us. So coming to the table and having conversations about solutions versus the problem, like we know that there's a problem, but you know, how are we thinking about these solutions and not just band-aid solutions? We're talking long-term solutions. I really miss that part of everything that's happening. It's like no one's coming to the tables with solutions. It's a shift in our thinking, right? And how we approach the problem, but it's like we gotta step back and get that larger picture from outside looking in, like where are the solutions at? So, you know, of course, for me, it's really disheartening knowing that back in 81, they were trying to get a Native American studies. You still don't have a Native American studies. Like, seriously, like even when I was going to school here, oh yeah, I'm an alum too, graduated with votes. I took every single Native American class I could possibly take. But for my own, it was for me, it was my personal investment, but still, even then and today, there's still not, that issue is still not addressed. So, no, it wasn't really a comment, question, thought, so just sharing that. I'm looking for solutions to some of the problems that we are facing here on campus as a collective.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is still a campus, even though there have been strides, for sure. But it's still a campus that, even though it has a status of an HSI, you know, it has status of ANAPZ, it still does not have anywhere near strong numbers in terms of Indigenous students. there has been some growth in Black student numbers. It still is a campus where, and I think here of Becca Covarrubias's report, calling out whiteness, looking at leadership and indicting leadership on this campus, because the people who get to make the decisions here, but also if we're thinking about the UC regions, I often use this metaphor, you know, there's like that Dr. Seuss book that was written in the wake of World War II called Important Here's a Who. And supposedly it was that Theodore Geisel went to Japan after having done all this wartime propaganda against the Japanese, dehumanizing them, and then met people who were victims of US bombing and realized that, like Horton, he'd never bothered to think about the Who's as living, breathing, you know, entities whatsoever. And I often feel like there is a kind of disconnect. And so one thing that Becca Covarrubias, her and Kat Quinteros's report suggests that one way toward materializing solutions is shifting who's actually making the decisions. It's distributing the decision-making power, you know, and that is hard in this hierarchical structure of the university. Oftentimes change is very incremental, and Angel, as you're saying, it's like you look at 1981 and you look at students who went on a hunger strike for Native American studies, you know, and where is it? Right? I mean, this is not to say that Indigenous Faculty Network hasn't done amazing work. There has been amazing work, but I understand and I hear you. And I think that part of this too is understanding that the university is a very critical site of struggle, and it should be an object of critique pretty ceaselessly.
All right, folks, and with that, unfortunately, we won't have time for more questions, but for the folks in the Zoom, we'll be sure to share your questions with Professor Hong. And I do have some closing remarks before I release you from this. So thank you everyone for attending the Fall 23 HSI Equity Talk today. We'll be sending out a brief survey following this event that we ask you to complete should you have the time and energy to do so. We also want to encourage our community to reach out should any of you have any ideas for an equity talk you yourself would like to present. Please feel free to reach out to me directly via email. We would love to hear from you. Next quarter, you can join us on February 22nd for the next HSI Equity Talk featuring Jody Green, the AVC for Teaching and Learning here at UCSC. And in the spring, we'll be hosting Dr. Ebony Williams, AVC for Student Success and Equity. And we'll be sure to share more information on those talks soon. On behalf of the HSI and the CRJ, thank you all for being here and holding space with us today. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your days. Thank you again, Christine.